You picture the artist by torchlight, a man. Broad-shouldered, scarred, a hunter who has just speared a bison and crept into the dark to paint his triumph on the stone. For more than a century, that was the official story, told by serious scholars who were absolutely certain that the genius behind the first art on Earth belonged to men. But the walls themselves disagree. Look closely at the painted caves of France and Spain, and you will find something stranger than any painted beast. You will find hands. Hundreds of them, pressed flat against the rock while someone blew red ochre across the skin. Ochre is simply a powder made from iron-rich clay, the oldest paint humans ever used. When the hand is lifted away, a ghostly outline stays behind. A hand that says one thing across 40,000 years of silence. I was here. And whose hands were they? For most of the 20th century, almost nobody asked. The man who shaped how the entire world saw cave art was a French priest named Henri Breuil, nicknamed the Pope of Prehistory. Breuil decided the paintings were hunting magic. Ritual images, he said, made by men to magically guarantee a successful hunt. It was a tidy story. It was also a guess dressed up as fact, built on a quiet assumption that the important things in the deep past were always done by men. Then a scientist actually measured the hands. His name is Dean Snow, an archaeologist at Pennsylvania State University. Snow knew something your own hands can prove right now. Look down at them. In most men, the ring finger is noticeably longer than the index finger. In most women, those two fingers sit much closer to the same length. It is a small, reliable difference in proportion, and it survives even as a flat outline traced on a cave wall. So Snow measured the stencils. He studied hands at famous caves like Pech Merle and Gargas in France and El Castillo in Spain. He compared their finger ratios against hundreds of living people, and the result quietly demolished the old story. Roughly 3 out of every 4 hands were female. Sit with that for a moment. The cave art you were taught to picture as a gallery of mighty male hunters was, by this evidence, made largely by women, not as assistants, not as bystanders holding the torch, as the artists themselves pressing their own hands to the stone and signing the dark, and the hands only got more surprising. Some of them were tiny. At a cave in France called Rouffignac, researchers including Leslie Van Gelder studied delicate lines dragged through the soft clay-like film that coats the walls. These marks are called finger flutings. By measuring the width and the spacing of the grooves, the team could estimate the size of the hand that made each one. Many belonged to children. A few belonged to children as young as 2 or 3 years old, lifted up, it seems, to drag their little fingers across the ceiling. These were not the private workshops of lonely male geniuses. They were crowded with women and children. So let's reconstruct what actually happened down there. The torch gutters and spits. The cave is cold and close and smells of damp stone and burning fat. A woman kneels with a hollow bird bone and a mouthful of red ochre. She presses her left hand flat against the rock, fingers spread wide, and blows a fine mist of pigment over it. When she pulls her hand away, her shape remains, glowing in the firelight. Beside her, a small child reaches up and drags 4 fingers through the soft film on the wall and laughs at the marks. An older woman steadies another child on her shoulders. This is not a solitary act of magic. It is a family, together in the deepest room of the world, leaving proof that they were alive. How old is that proof? Older than you can comfortably imagine. Using a method called uranium-thorium dating, the archaeologist Alistair Pike measured the age of the thin mineral crust that slowly grows over the paint, like a calendar written in stone. He found that a single-hand stencil at El Castillo is at least 37,000 years old, older than farming, older than the end of the last ice age, older than almost everything you have ever thought of as human history. But here is where it stops being merely surprising and turns genuinely strange. In a Spanish cave called Maltravieso, there is one lone hand stencil. A team led by Dirk Hoffman dated the crust covering it, and the number that came back was more than 64,000 years old. That is a serious problem, because your species, modern humans, had not yet set foot in Europe 64,000 years ago. So whose hand was it? A Neanderthal's. The slouching, brutish cave dweller of every cartoon and every old textbook may have pressed his palm to that rock and blown red ochre across it tens of thousands of years before your own ancestors ever walked into the valley, which means the impulse to leave a handprint, to insist I am here, may be older than humanity itself. So why were you taught the other story? Why the lone male hunter, the lone genius, the lone shaman? Because the people who first crawled into those caves and wrote the books were men, living in a world that simply assumed art and meaning and mastery belonged to men. So they looked at 40,000-year-old hands, and they quietly painted their own faces onto them. They did not discover the past. They reflected themselves backward into it, and you do the exact same thing those cave painters did. Think about it. A child's painted handprint stuck to a refrigerator door, 2 palms pressed into a fresh square of wet cement on a sidewalk, your initials carved into a school desk, a tree, a wooden beam in an attic, a name scratched into a foggy bathroom mirror. Every single one of those is a hand stencil. Everyone is the same ancient sentence, repeated without a thought. I was here. I existed. Remember me. That urge did not begin with you. It did not begin with men, or with hunters, or even with your own kind. It began with a woman, and a child, and a creature that was not quite human, all kneeling in the dark with a mouthful of red dust. So picture the artist, by torchlight one last time, not a lone man crouched over his kill. A mother, a daughter, a grandmother, and something older than your species, all of them reaching for the same cold wall, all of them pressing down the oldest message in the world.